So for this panel, I've kind of envisioned a slightly informal setup, kind of just interested in talking about the Talon Manual, how it came to be, what kind of the problems were, what went well, and then also questions about the upcoming Talon Manual too. But first, let me introduce you to our other two panelists. We have Professor Sean Watts, who is a professor of law at Creighton University School of Law, where he teaches constitutional law, federal courts, federal habeas corpus, the law of armed conflict, international criminal law, and military law. He also serves as an instructor at the United States Military Academy at West Point in his capacity as Lieutenant Colonel in the Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Army, JAG Reserve. His primary research interest is international legal regulation of emerging forms of warfare. From 2010 to 2012, Professor Watts participated in drafting the Talon Manual, and he is currently a senior fellow at the NATO Collective Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. Prior to teaching, Professor Watts served as an active duty U.S. Army officer for 15 years in legal and operational assignments, including Professor of International Law at the Army JAG School, Rule of Law Advisor to the Afghan National Army and Ministry of Defense, Chief of Federal Tort Claims, and Trial Defense Counsel. Professor Watts was recently awarded Creighton School of Law's Outstanding Faculty Member of the Year and the American Society of International Law Francis Lieber Military Prize.
We're laughing because I think he was the one that voted him on.
Yeah. Eric gave it to me.
Now you have the backstory.
Inside joke. I hope that wasn't recorded.
Totally well deserved. It's a great paper.
We also have Eric Jensen, who teaches and writes in the areas of public international law, criminal law, the law of armed conflict, international criminal law, and national security law. He's a professor at Brigham Young University Law, and prior to joining the BYU Law faculty in 2011, Professor Jensen spent 2 years teaching at the Fordham Law School in New York City and 20 years in the United States Army as both a cavalry officer and as a judge advocate. During his time as a judge advocate, Professor Jensen served in various positions, including the chief of the Army's International Law Branch, deputy legal advisor for Task Force Baghdad, professor of international and operational law at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School, and legal advisor to the U.S. continent of UN forces deployed to Skopje, Macedonia, as part of UNPREDP. Professor Jensen received an LLM from Yale Law School, as well as an LLM from the Judge Advocate General School. He also has a JD from the University of Notre Dame and a BA from Brigham Young University. So, first of all, Professor Watts and Professor Jensen, do you have any kind of follow-up points or anything to add to Professor Schmidt's keynote?
Go easy, boys. Go easy.
It was all wrong. Actually, no. I just told Mike I wanted some of his slides because I thought some of the points he made were especially interesting and some I hadn't heard him say before. It's interesting to hear. So we've been beat up for the last 3 years during Talon 1 about that's lex ferenda. Stop thinking about that. Stop thinking about that. Stop thinking about that. And then to hear Mike stand up and talk about where he thinks the law is going to go, I thought was extremely interesting. And basically I agree with everything he said. So I don't have any negative comments about anything he said. I think he's exactly right.
Well, I was thrilled to be included in the project. My only reservation was, why do they have to have this in Estonia? Why does this have to be in some former Soviet republic? And I was totally wrong on that. It is just a gorgeous place. The people are incredibly friendly. Any opportunity you have to visit this wonderful place, you should take up. I'll reinforce what Mike said as well, in that whenever it says the minority view in the Talon Manual, that's me. I don't think you're violating the Chatham House rule if you rat yourself out. So he's right. They spent most of their time trying to get me to agree to stuff.
But, but I have to say, that's the strength. I've been involved in a lot of these projects. So I was involved in the Harvard Air and Missile Warfare Manual Project and the ICRC's Direct Participation Project, which you're probably talking about at some point in your IHL course, and Non-International Armed Conflict by the Institute for Humanitarian Law. And there's a difference. This is the first time a group of experts said, let's admit that we don't necessarily know the answer. So in the manual, the strength, the weakness of the manual lies in the black letter rules, because we had to achieve unanimity in the black letter rules. There are 95 of them. And so in order to achieve unanimity, we had to convince Sean to vote yes at some point. And what that meant was wordsmithing. It was very much like writing a treaty. And even though the ICRC didn't have a voice and didn't have a vote, we would seldom go forward without their assent and so forth. So those rules are very, very broad. The strength of this manual is that we captured in an extensive commentary to each rule the various views. So it's very common to see the majority believe that. However, a minority felt that, and sometimes we acknowledge, as in the case of the U.S. view on the gap between Article 2.4 and Article 51, we said we acknowledge the existence of another viewpoint. And so the reason this is valuable, if I'm sitting in, Rome, Marco's here, if I'm sitting in Rome at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and I'm trying to deal with a cyber incident, and I'm trying to understand a cyber incident, I can open the manual and I can say, okay, so I see what the majority view is, but I don't think that's consistent with my national policy, or that's not the approach we've taken. I note here that there's a minority view. Let me go talk to the legal advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the alternative views and see which one Rome wants to adopt. So I would anticipate that if we rewrote this 10 years down the road, minority views would become majority views would fade away entirely. No one accepted that, but I think that's the strength of the manual. Because, for example, when we were doing air and missile warfare manual, it was run by a brilliant guy, Yoram Dinstein, a famous Israeli scholar. We had to come to a conclusion not only on the rules but on the commentary, and I believe that's the weakness of the manual, because states will read that and it loses credibility when the state goes, but I don't think that rule's right. We take an entirely different view. We worked hard to get all the various views in. The other thing we did was what Eric talked about a moment ago. We were very, very, I was brutal in this regard. Listen, lawyers, especially law professors, always want to wax eloquent on what the law should be. If only the law, listen, the Texas International Law Journal, I'm sure, is full of this kind of nonsense. But if I'm sitting at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I could care less what you think the law should be. I need to know what the law is. That's called lex lata, not lex ferenda. So we were very cautious when, seriously, this happens many times. Eric would say something, and then I would scream from across the room, lex ferenda, that's lex ferenda. We do lex lata here, because our client was different. It wasn't an academic endeavor. It was an academic endeavor, but not one designed to move law in a particular direction. We took the law as we found it. In fact, as of a particular date, June 2012. That was June. It was the date of the last meeting. We said it's the law on that date. Now, what it is in July of 2012, I don't know. We'll have to get new funding and check that out.
So where did the minority views come from? Was it from
Sean? We've already established this. Weren't you listening? From Sean. They came from Nebraska. Okay.
Mike has never said anything truer than when he said those minority views will become majority views. My views will become at some point.
So why has it taken a year for the kind of changes that will come about in the Talon 2? Were those discussed in Talon 1 in kind of a vision of what might change?
So can I just go back to your prior question about where the minority views came from?
Of course.
Often, actually, it was Sean. But But many, I mean, with the people who were at there, you got a flavor of who was there when Mike introduced that on the slide. There was a large contingent of Europeans. There was a smaller contingent of Americans, and then there was, and it was interesting for me to see how sometimes these alliances is the wrong word. It's too strong, but how people would join together in their understanding of what the law was and how they would formulate. And I went into it probably thinking that this was going to be an Americans versus Europeans project because the Europeans were so bizarre, they didn't understand the law, the Americans had it all right. And in truth, that's not at all how it played out. It was often mixed as to, in different ways than I would anticipate as to what the majority and minority was. But again, I think the strength of the manual is that it reflects all of that, and to the fact that it can be useful to you, it's that it reflects all of that. You wanted to...
Well, if there was a substantive difference, I think that pervades the minority-majority split, I think it's with respect to rule skepticism. I think maybe the three of us were probably the strongest rule skeptics. Each of us had an awfully high bar for something to count as a rule of international law to make it into that black letter rule, whereas I think maybe some of the other contributors were more receptive to non-traditional inputs, that if you had enough scholars saying something that it was a rule, if the U.S. hadn't been particularly aggressive about resisting a rule of custom, that it was probably good enough to call it custom. So I think it's a varying notion of what counts as a rule that may have split the majority and minority as much as anything else.
I remember one particular conversation with Sean in a hotel lobby where I was arguing for something, and he said, look, I'll agree with you if you'll just show me anywhere in the law where it says that. And I was arguing, well, come on, it's got to be, it makes so much sense, this is clearly what's happening. And he just said, just show me anywhere in the law where it says that. And I think that was a real teaching point for me, and to the extent that you are trying to glean things that we learned when you go off and do these similar type events. I mean, I think that's an excellent approach. Sean kept us honest in show me where the law says that, and then we'll talk about it.
By the way, the manual is a restatement of customary law. You should know that. It's not a restatement of treaty law, because on many of these questions, there is in fact treaty law, but it's treaty law which a number of states, typically the United States, a number of states are not party to. So we wanted to produce a manual that would be global. So in very, very, very few cases, we reflect a particular treaty norm, and then we say it's usually Additional Protocol 1, and we say for states that are party to Additional Protocol 1, there is this additional requirement. But the fact that it was customary law made it much more difficult because of this, because we could sometimes show state practice, but we had no expressions of opinio juris. Or we had expressions of opinio juris, but it's just states talking. There was no state practice. And we had, it's very interesting because one of the countries that goes to war a lot happens to be our own country. And so the question was, well, how do we deal with the American perspective on particular rules? For example, the rule on perfidy. How do we deal with the American perspective on the rule of perfidy? Because if we're doing customary international law and we're not bound by the additional protocol, then you have to ask the question, can you have a customary norm if the United States, which engages in warfare a lot, has expressed opposition to a particular statement? Or are we somehow a persistent objector? Or are we a specially affected state? So all the stuff you learned in your basic international law course with regard to the formation of norms played in here. And so you'll see, I think you'll see, we took a very conservative approach. It was very interesting, the reaction of states to this project. It's a very different reaction this time around. When we started the project, even within NATO, people were freaked out because there's this guy and he's got all of his buds and they're purporting to write the law, and, you know, holy cow, I mean, like we haven't had a cyber war much, and, you know, what's going on here? And they were freaked out that what would happen is that, and I'll give you an example of where this in fact has happened, where some people that don't make law wrote a book, and because it's the only thing on the shelf, when states start saying, what's the law, they pull the book off the shelf and they look it up and say, that's the law. So they were very nervous about these 20 people going off to Estonia 4 times a year, writing this manual. And so they were at they held us at arm's length. There was opposition within NATO, there was opposition from states. It was very funny, though. Behind the scenes, of course, as you've heard from our bios, a lot of us have connections, not only in the United States, but around the world, to ministries of foreign affairs and ministries of defense. So many times we would get calls that would say, like, shalom. I won't tell you what country. Shalom, Mike. Hey, listen, can you shoot us your draft? We just kind of want to take a look at it. We won't tell anyone, blah, 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 blah. So there was a lot of that behind the scenes. States were holding us at arm's length, but at the other hand, they understood that this process, if it got traction, would have enormous influence on the way the law was interpreted by legal advisors around the world. So they were very interested. And there had been precedent. And the precedent was a very famous project. You may or may not have heard of it in your classes, called the project run by the ICRC on direct participation in hostilities. It's a project that the ICRC undertook. It was a 5-year project with, I think there were 40 experts. I was one of the Americans. I think there was Hayes Parks and one other. Anyways, we did this project to look at Article 51.3 of the first additional protocol, and Article, I think it's 13.1, 13.2, something. Anyways, Article 13 of the second additional protocol that says that you can't shoot civilians, but they lose their protection for such time as they directly participate in hostilities. And so the question was, well, what is direct participation? What does for such time mean? Because during that window, you can attack civilians, those civilians. So there was this 5-year project that went on. I will tell you the way it ended, because Professor Chesney and Professor Jinks, it wasn't you, I'm sorry, it was at NYU.
Waxman Goodman.
No, it was Ryan. Ryan and Derek, who are buddies, okay, they're buddies. They organized a forum at NYU. What's that?
Me and Derek are buddies too.
Well, okay, but I haven't seen evidence of that. But he's not here now. You're here. I'm just kind of wondering, But at any rate, they organized a forum. What happened in that project? It went 5 years. In the 4th year, in the middle of the 4th year, the ICRC introduced a chapter to the document. It's called the infamous Chapter 9. And that broke up the project. 12 individuals, I was one of them, withdrew from the project because we said this is fundamentally opposed to our understanding of the law. Our country will never accept it, blah, 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 blah. But, so the ICRC issues the document, has an ICRC document. What happens? Instantly, countries around the world say, that's the law. Oh, the ICRC issued this document. This must be the law, despite the fact that the Canadians withdrew from the project, the Israelis, the Americans, the Brits, we all withdrew from the project because we felt that it was an inaccurate reflection of the law. But because it was published, and because somebody was trying to write policy for their country in Afghanistan or whatever, they can reach behind the shelf, pull it off, and there you go, that's the law. And it found its way into rules of engagement that found their way onto the battlefield in Afghanistan and Iraq, with states that would surprise you, like the Australians. I was down working with the Australians, and they had adopted it. So states, given that experience, they were freaked out about this, because here we have 20 people, they're going to make the law, this is very important, we don't know where this body of law is going. I think, though, the reaction has been pretty positive. There was this enormous brouhaha over NATO, because we have a rule on direct participation that says if you're a civilian and you're sending cyber attacks during an armed conflict, then you're directly participating, so we can attack you. So, headlines read, NATO says you can attack hackers, with no context. But I think it's been now fairly well accepted. So in this process, states are very interested, and they're interested in being involved in the open, in the Tallinn 2.0 project. And in fact, the Estonians, I think, the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs will host on the margins of a General Assembly meeting, a meeting of states that will assess the product before we go public with it, so we can take account of state reaction. It was all very interesting.
So on that note of kind of state reaction and a meeting of states with Tallinn 2, are there any states that you would see as integral to this conversation that weren't involved in Tallinn 1? Or
I don't know, go ahead.
or do you think that since since it was just kind of stating the law as it was, the perspective wasn't necessary.
I mean, you guys, I mean, they're all looking at me, so I'll answer because I was educated at the University of Texas, so I've got an answer for everything. So, like, we were heavily criticized for that. I assume that's why you're answering the question. It's like, this is the Western view of international law, blah, blah, blah. You know, we have these guys. We all three were in the military. You know, we have common backgrounds. A bunch of like-minded people talking to each other, which wasn't accurate at all. It is true that most of them were Western, and this is politically incorrect, so we should probably edit this out of the recording. But listen, most of the great scholars in international law happen to be from Western countries. They are in the UK, Western Europe, the United States. I mean, the real heavyweights that work in this field happen to be at Nottingham or at Texas and places like that. So that was one of the problems. The other thing is I kind of don't buy into the notion very much that states take dramatically different views of international law. I mean, I believe it's international law. You know, it isn't regional law, it's international law. We are sensitive to the criticism. So the three of us have just come a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, from Tartu University, which is very much like Tartu University in Estonia is like the University of Texas in America. It's the finest of the law schools. So we were at the University of Tartu, and they invited scholars from China, Belarus, Slovakia, Russia, the people who hadn't participated in the Tallinn I process in response to this criticism. There's a scholar there, a professor there, who wrote a review of the Tallinn Manual, and that was his criticism. They didn't invite any of us. So I met the guy, I went to lunch with him. I was in his country. I said, so let's go to lunch, let's talk, let's be friends. So you have this criticism, so like we'll organize something at your university, you can bring anyone you want. And that's what we just did. I don't know how you guys felt, but I had a sense that when the Chinese scholar from Wuhan University, when he explained the law of attribution, which I'll speak about tomorrow morning, I mean, I could have used his slides here. They were identical. I didn't see much of a difference. Yeah, are there different views? Politically, yes, but with respect to lawyers and attorneys who are being honest about the law, I don't see that much of a difference. So there was a criticism. There were practical reasons with Tallinn I. We had 3 years. Okay, so when I picked the people, I wanted superb scholars. These are two just first-rate scholars. They also had to be, because I've been through these other processes, they had to be people that got along well with others. They had to play well with others, but we made an exception for Sean. They had to play well with others because other projects had been hobbled by infighting. I can't take it. I have the vapors. I need to leave. And they had to be willing to objectively look at the law. They had to be willing to have the sorts of discussions that Eric did. But that meant that the group wasn't very international. So we're trying to address it this time by having meetings here and there. We're arranging one in Australia. When I was in London, I arranged to have one in Australia. We had one at Tartu where we bring in voices from elsewhere. But I think what we're going to hear is we're going to hear sort of the same approach. When you hear the Chinese or the Russians on TV, you know, doing this, you're not hearing objective legal scholars tell you what their view is. Listen, I mean, the guy from China was talking about state responsibility. He was citing the International Law Commission's articles of state responsibility. It happens to be exactly what we're looking at when we're doing Tallinn too. So.
Yeah, if I can just echo that, you know, you hear a lot about the cyber controversy between, for example, Russia and China in the international group of experts in the UN process and the U.S. position. And you hear about how China and Russia are not sure, or were not sure in the past, that the law of armed conflict actually applied to cyber issues, although they're changing on that view. I mean, these, I think, as Mike said, these are political statements. These are policy statements. And we at least have found, when you actually sit down and talk with the lawyers, that the gap is less broad. There will still be differences, just as there are differences between the U.S. view and a German view, or the Australian view and a Canadian view. I mean, there'll still be differences, but the differences, I think, are overstated compared to what they actually are.
I agree. I think it's mostly of symbolic value. If part of the goal of the manual is for it to be to be used widely, that there may be a cost to this lack of diversity in that respect. But I'll confess, I'm still searching for the substantive differences that would have come out from that diversity.
You know, I will tell you, I mean, other countries, the Chinese, I'm told, have already translated into Chinese. I don't know, you know, they do that. Day before yesterday, so I get a package in my office. It looks like books. I'm excited because I'm a professor, free books. This is cool. I open it up, and it's like this, it's got a little picture of the Talon manual in front. What is this? And I went down to some people down the hall. It looked like Oriental writing, Asian writing. It was Korean. They just translated into Korea. So it's got traction. When I get back next week, the Japanese Defense College, they're coming to the War College, talk to us about the Talon manual. So I think, you know, it's resonating. All of the people that were at this meeting, they all had used the Talon manual. So it seems to have, despite its Western orientation, it's selling well. So
the question I had asked earlier of, was there any kind of foreshadowing of the changes that would come with Talon 2 when you were preparing Talon 1?
Yeah,
Well, I mean, so it's probably generous to even call Talon 1 the tip of the iceberg in cyber, right? It represents, you know, 1,000th of a fraction of something of what goes on in cyberspace, and you know, we knew that going in. That wasn't something we were unaware of. We knew we were writing a very narrow manual. It was, you know, I think a function largely of our prior experience and expertise. It was what was asked of us as well. But sure, we get not halfway through Talon 1.0, we begin to realize, hey, wait, you know, most of the examples we would drum up, if you look through the commentary, I think some of the more useful conversations are where we try to operationalize these black letter rules with state A and state B and state C and so forth. But as we would go through these examples, or as the technical guys would try to generate them, often they had a hard time clearing our thresholds of application. They would come up with a magnificent example of cyber confrontation between two parties, but the group would all agree that it wasn't an attack and it didn't implicate the law of war. Or it was a terrifically prescient example of a cyber operation that was very likely to happen in the very near future, and wouldn't it be wonderful to have that in the manual, but it didn't manage to hit the use of force threshold, which of course was the focus of the manual. And so, of course, we're logging that away, and when Talon 1.0 was over, it wasn't that hard to decide that somebody needed to do something below the threshold. And that, of course, is the focus of Talon 2.0. We're marketing it that way and trying to look at things below the threshold of the use of force. That's I think, what you'll see is the greatest expansion in substantive coverage of 2.0. It's been fantastically interesting. I think it'll cover a far greater scope of what happens in cyberspace, but I think also much more difficult. I think the ambiguity that we're encountering, I think the level of vagueness with which states have committed to these norms of international law, especially for something of a rule skeptic like me, has made this work, I think, in many ways much more difficult than 1.0.
I mean, it's because it is much more, I mean, that's one of the reasons the group is smaller. I mean, if you're dealing with issues of state responsibility and due diligence and, you know, issues like that, they are complicated legal issues. And to try to do that with 20 individuals, golly, that would be really hard. So I will tell you, one of the reasons we didn't have quite as much money on this round as we did in the first round, but it was also a product of, I don't think we could do this with 20 people. We would just never get finished, or we would finish, but we would just be able to do a tiny slice. You know, in this area, this was law in which there was a great deal of state practice. Now we're dealing with law in which there's not a great deal of state practice, and much, much, much more complicated. So we were very careful about the team we picked. I will tell you, we threw caution to the wind with regard to, you know, 3 Americans and a German isn't very diverse. That's one of the reasons why we're doing these, if you will, outreach projects and so forth. And meetings with states, but it's just a really complicated area of law. I mean, I was talking with Marco, who will speak tomorrow morning, on before we started, on the issue of the evidentiary standard that's required for a state to respond with a countermeasure, has distinct from the evidentiary standard that would be applied before an international tribunal or an arbitral panel, and golly, that's hard stuff. I mean, that really makes your head hurt. So, now, I will tell you, the way it's going to work, we think, in fact, I got a phone call on Monday with Cambridge, we just think we're going to take this and make it bigger, because we want, it's going to be the same format, same approach, and it just will expand, and we'll take 3 years and see where we are and then publish at that point. With regard to the Tallinn Manual, the Tallinn 1, we will give states an opportunity to react to Tallinn 1 at these meetings of states. And so we can get their feedback. I mean, if all the states come forward to us, if we get 30 states telling us, you know, we thought your majority rule was all wrong, then we're willing to make changes to that. But we're not working on that right now actively.
So the benefit, as I see it, to the way we've done Tallinn 2 is fewer writers and more state and other input. Yeah. And that has benefits all the way around. Fewer writers means you get through it faster, supposedly, although I'm not sure that's actually working out. But you get through it faster, get something on paper faster. Yeah.
You're trying, man.
And then you get more.
It's not my fault.
So you get it written down faster, and then you provide more opportunity for people to provide input, and that's what we're hoping we can do with Tallinn 2.
The first process was really complicated. I mean, one of the questions, your preview questions that you sent us was, how did you do this? Because it might be interesting. How do projects like this work, these international projects? So it was a complicated process, some of which didn't work. We had a small group. Professor Jenks was one of them. I think there were 5 of us. We met in Tallinn to scope the project, where we built a notional table of contents. What do we want to do with? Do we want to do with both youth ad bellum and in bello, broader, so we built that table of contents. Then we invited 15 other individuals to join the process, and that created what we called the plenary. And then we would assign topics to individuals. So Eric, go write text, a rule and text on this. So we had 20 people go out, and then they would come back and bring it back, and we discussed it in plenary, and then we would give it out to 3 groups, headed by Professor Watts, Professor Jensen, and then a Brit, Air Commodore Boothby. And they had a group of 3 or 4 people, and they would try to perfect the first draft. Didn't work so well because not everyone has exactly the same work ethic. And so like they would bring it, then they would bring their product from the working groups back into plenary. We put it back together, discuss it, and then it was still pretty rough. And so then what happened is, once we got all the working group stuff back together, okay, that took a year and a half, almost 2 years. Then we created a drafting committee. It consisted of myself, Air Commodore Boothby from the Royal Air Force, and Professor Dr. von Heinig. The 3 of us went off, along with a separate team of techies, just to vet the technical stuff. We put 1 lawyer, some of you know Tom Wingfield. Tom Wingfield, who kind of understood that techie stuff, with some wireheads, went over there and made sure our examples were all right. And then the 3 of us would literally sit locked in a room with a PowerPoint looking at, okay, next line. And Wolf and I would argue. We've worked on many projects together, and then Bill would correct our English because he was British. So it took a long time. This one is a lot more streamlined because, when we picked the group, I picked the group because so I picked the people. I mean, I will tell you, I picked 3 superb lawyers. And I'll tell you why I picked them. I picked von Heine because he's a brilliant lawyer, and he and I have worked together for many years. Many years. He's probably my closest colleague professionally. We picked Professor Jensen because he's a superb lawyer, but he's also a lawyer who's really well grounded and objective. He is honest man, okay, in the group. We picked Professor Watts because he's also another absolutely superb lawyer, and frankly, the reason he was picked is because he is an outside-the-box thinker. He doesn't think the way, hopefully, you think. He is the guy who is always saying, I'm not sure that's right. Have you thought about it this way? And then we all go, wow, here we go again. But he's a lateral thinker. So we wanted to have, whereas Professor Jensen keeps us grounded, he is honest man, he is objectivity incarnate. Professor Watts is show me. You know, where is the state practice for that? Shut up, I think there is state practice. Well, where, what's the opinion? I mean, demanding that this actually be the law. So the team works pretty good. Von Heining is, I consider him to be one of the top international lawyers in the world. And then, so we built this group, and I think it's doing pretty well. We also have a support team, someone who tracks what's going on in the world for us. Hey, have you heard about this event? And also as a military officer, so a potential user. So every once in a while, his name's Stinnison, Colonel Stinnison. Every once in a while we go, hey, Jan, that text, do you understand that? Would you be able to use this? Would you be able to provide advice to the Dutch Ministry of Defense? And then we have a guy named...
You called him so many other things now you don't know
his
what
name
his
is, I don't know, anyone speak German here? Oh my God, Texas has changed. Okay, his name's Bernhard Baumberg, which means strong bear mountain flower. Okay, he's Latvian. So at any rate, so we call him strong flower and mountain bear. We change it up, but he's a wirehead. He's a wirehead that can communicate with people who aren't. So he can say, no, that's not the way it works in cyberspace. So it's a tight little team. We meet 4 times a year, and I actually go over there a few more times for bits and pieces. And so it seems to be going pretty well, although slow. I mean, you probably picked up from the giggles. We're going slower, but I've never been in a project. I mean, the direct participation, 3-year project took 5 years. Air and missile warfare, 3-year project took 5 years. 3-year project took 3 years, but only because we brutalized people. I mean, just brutalized them, beat them into submission. And so 3 years. So these things tend to take longer than planned. So the answer is when you do this, when you're all academics, ask for more money than you think you need, because you will in fact spend it. Okay. Do you guys have any questions?
Yeah, I was about to ask. We have a mic.
I can pray loud. I don't actually know if this is the right session to be asking this, but since I figured you guys just wrote the rules on this, I'm particularly interested in the non-state actor issue and sort of the development of that. You know, in Professor Chesney's seminar, we talk about distinction all the time.
About what? Distinction?
Distinction. So this principle of distinguishing between civilians and and so I guess in the cyberspace context, and I haven't read the manual, to be honest, so I don't know.
Shocked.
So I need a
Student
copy.
that's unprepared for class at the University of Texas, out with you.
But I was
You're
wondering.
supposed to sit in the last row, if I remember right. You're supposed to sit in the last
No,
row.
no, I'm a gunner, so I'm right here. So in that sense, I guess I'm wondering if you could just kind of briefly go over where the parameters are in terms of distinguishing between non-state actors and actors, because in regular armed conflict we have, you know, these touchstones of whether or not they're in uniform and whether or not they have insignia, and how's that, I don't know, how do you distinguish between just a regular hacker and sort of a non-state actor that's actually engaging in conflict?
Yeah, maybe Sean can take this, wrote an article on it, so.
Okay.
Well, yeah, so there are some rules, you're right, from the law of war, or IHL. I have this new rule, by the way. I used to call it law of war. Sometimes I'll call it law of armed conflict, IHL. It's all the same thing, right? What I call it is a function of who bought my plane ticket. If the ICRC bought my plane ticket, I'll call it IHL, but I'm much more of a law of war guy. But all right, so the law of war does have these rules about identifying persons on the battlefield. It has these rules about the consequences of how a person appears on the battlefield. One thing that united all of us is that it does not have a rule about the lawfulness of participation. That is, the group, I think we were
Right.
unanimous.
Unanimous on that.
Yeah, I think the entire plenary session was unanimous that whether you're participating as a non-state actor or as an agent of a state that isn't in the armed forces, or a person that is wearing the wrong thing on the battlefield, international law has nothing to say about the lawfulness of your participation. Now, there are consequences, of course. Appearing a certain way on the battlefield can subject you to intentional targeting. Failing to appear can subject you to different rules of treatment upon capture. But I was surprised by the unanimity on that topic. I was expecting some resistance and some more variance of views. With respect to how to treat certain persons that you might encounter participating in hostilities in cyberspace, that I did think split us. So we took on the DPH question, the question of what one has to do in order to disqualify oneself from the general protection that civilians enjoy from intentional targeting. That did split us. So I mean, there were some that had a more aggressive view that thought, well, even training persons to do cyber warfare, even writing the program, the malware that is eventually used constitutes direct participation in hostilities. Some, and I think this typified the European view, required a much more proximate relationship between what that person did and actual harm to a system or harm to persons. They were looking for this sort of like your false graph analysis, right? No intervening cause, shiver just went up everyone's spine. But yeah, so there was a spectrum of views there, and I think the Europeans had a narrower notion of what counted as DPH and what would open that hacker up to being targeted by some horrible NATO operation.
You know, I was one of the experts for the DPH, for the Direct Participation Project, and it's my sense that the debates that we had in the DPH project, the Air and Missile Warfare Project was run by Harvard. It was run it would launched halfway through the DPH process and extended beyond it. So I was on the drafting committee for that as well. There were 5 of us on that drafting committee. So we had the DPH guidance, the interpretive guidance, on our desk as we were finishing up Air and Missile. And my sense there was that exactly the same things that split us conceptually in the DPH interpretive guidance split us when we applied to Air and Missile Warfare, and then split us again when we went to the Tallinn manual. So yeah, of course there are some around the margins, you know, programmer versus someone who builds an IED, an improvised explosive devices, but it's the same issues that are splitting us. Do we view the notion of DPH broadly? Are we slaved to the 3 elements of direct participation set forth in the guidance, or not? If you have an organized armed group, maybe you've discussed that, because if it's an organized armed group, you can treat them as the military. If you have an organized armed group of hackers, can you target everyone in the group, or only those that have a, quote, continuous combat function, which term that was resonant in the DPH guidance, which many of us are opposed to? So the same issues seem to split us. There were a couple of interesting ones, really interesting ones. So here's one. You know, the way this works is you have combatants and you can attack them all the time, okay? If you apply the interpretive guidance approach. And then you've got civilians, and you can attack them for such time as they directly participate in the hostilities. But then you've got this middle group that was invented. I was there at the birth of this notion, called the organized armed group. And the ICRC was willing to accept the notion that if you're an organized armed group, then you can be treated for targeting purposes just like members of the armed forces. In other words, you could be attacked all the time. Now, we had a big fight over something called continuous combat function. Do you have to be what we call a shooter in the group, or is it everyone in the group? Need not detain us here. But in cyberspace, an interesting question that we struggle with and that we talk about in the manual is, so like, what's an organized armed group in cyberspace? Because in cyberspace, you can have a group that's organized virtually, and you never meet, and you don't know who the other people are. And so how do can you have, sort of one of the requirements for an organized armed group is that it be organized, and it needs some kind of kind of command structure, not like the military, but sort of kind of. Well, can you do that in cyberspace? How do you impose discipline on a virtual group that you may not even know who the individuals are? So we had debates like, well, the cyber guys all said, oh yeah, there's discipline in these kind of groups. You can be kicked out of the group. And for those of us who have been in the military, we thought, I don't think getting kicked out of the group is like the discipline we were thinking of in terms of compliance with IHL in cyberspace. So that was that aspect of it was really, really interesting. When you have a non-state group, can it and it's not involved in kinetic activities, it's only involved in cyber, can that group qualify as an organized armed group for the purposes of targeting, such that you can kill them because they're members of the group based on their status as members. Interesting question. So there were some around the margins. But many of the debates that we had were debates about questions that are present throughout international humanitarian law. So Sean is, I think, the expert on perfidy. But, the United perfidy is when you feign protected status in order to kill or wound a member of the enemy forces. But I believe that the Europeans and the additional protocol extends that to surrender, but the United States does not accept that. So here we go again. We had this debate, with people saying, wait a minute, we'll put the perfidy rule in, but we're only going to accept feigning protected status in order to kill or wound in cyberspace, and we're not going to accept capture because the Americans don't. So often we cyberize the same debates that we had in humanitarian, just in law generally,
So I'm going to stand up just because I can't see you if I'm standing at the mic, if I'm sitting at the table. But I just would say one other thing, and it goes back to what Mike said beforehand. One of the most interesting things, they both were talking about in bello non-state actors. I think one of the things that Mike brought up in his initial presentation that is to me one of the most interesting aspects of all of this is the ad bellum piece of non-state actors. You heard Mike talk a little bit about the state monopolization of violence and how, the Treaty of Westphalia, that's what that was all about. I'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow, but that's what that was all about. That was about some organization saying we will monopolize violence within our borders, and if violence comes from within our borders, you can assume we are somehow behind it because we're going to monopolize all of that. And that's what states kind of did in the Treaty of Westphalia. Well, non-state actors have always been able to participate on the battlefield and do bad things, but now with cyber, they can actually control state-level violence conceivably. And that, in a sense, I don't want to call it a game changer, that may be overstating it, but it's a significant issue, right? You have non-state actors who can initiate something that equates to an armed attack or a use of force, and that, in the past, that was not, we didn't think in terms of that when we thought about the law and formulated the law. And so I think this is a huge piece of cyber stuff that we're going to have to continue to evolve the rules, as Mike talked about, to figure out how to grasp. I was in Singapore a couple of years ago in the summer. I was giving this presentation, and nobody was really kind of paying attention to me. They were all talking. There was real buzz going on. I thought, boy, I'm really boring this time. What's going on? And no one had any questions afterwards. And as soon as I got done, I was attacked by all the people there because the United States had just announced that they reserved the right to respond to an armed attack or to a cyber attack as an armed attack and respond with kinetic force. And they were all coming to me saying, you mean a hacker from Singapore is going to hack you and you're going to shoot a missile down, his house? And so this is a really, really interesting issue that I think we're still trying to get our heads around in terms of how the law is going to deal with it over time, as Mike pointed out. So, again, I'm sorry for standing up. That looked really formal. I just couldn't see you from where I was sitting. Okay.
Are you disappointed or pleased?
Thanks. See, this is what I've had to deal with for the past 3 years.
Any other questions?
So a lot of what you're talking about when you're concerned about non-state actors is the black hat hacker or quasi-governmental hacking organizations. I'm really interested to hear to what extent the presence of such powerful non-state actors in the commercial realm impacted your thinking. When I think of an organization that can really leverage an enormous amount of expertise in the cyber realm, I think of Google and I think of Intel. And these are institutions which can serve a vital civilian function, but also can be quite destructive in cyber warfare. And I'm just curious to what extent, when you were crafting the rules, you thought about these institutions, if they participated, if you solicited their thoughts, just very broadly on that topic.
So I'll just answer initially. If you look in Talon 1, we deal with Article 58 briefly, Article 58 from AP1, which talks about precautions against attacks. In other words, what you have to do to protect the civilian population from attacks. And one of the issues that we talked about and had some debate on was, well, what do you do with Microsoft and Google and HP and those companies, as soon as a computer system in the government goes down, you know, they call these people, right? I mean, they call these companies, and they could not function without these companies' support. Does the government unintentionally make them targetable because they play such a key role in the continuing functionality of the government and government IT systems? And even from a different spin, and I think the spin you were after was how much, you know, how key a role do they play in the maintenance of infrastructure, right? I mean, there's this figure, I don't know how accurate it is, but a while ago the number was 95% of all government communication went over civilian infrastructure. All that civilian infrastructure is purchased, laid, maintained, you know, all that by civilians. We have rules to deal with that, but the cyber, the way we do things in the cyber realm just make that more drastic when we think about the input these systems have. We have not had probably, well, certainly not much as we could have, input from those kinds of folks. And to some extent, it's not as appropriate in this manual, right? Because this was about the laws of armed conflict. But that's certainly something that we ought to consider, you know, as we go forward, because the Talon 2.0 cyber confrontation, the corporate side of this is much more implicated and involved in that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. We didn't think much about it at all, to be honest with you. Not at all, because we were focused primarily on jus ad bellum, which is really an issue of interstate relations, although we touched on the non-state actor issue with regard to whether a non-state actor can conduct an armed attack. We said yes, so if a corporation did it, it's entirely plausible that a corporation could. Then that corporation would be subject to a use of force in response from a state actor against which they launched their attack. And of course, Professor Jensen is exactly right. To the extent that corporations are involved in the activities, then their individuals, the individuals that are so involved, become direct participants in hostilities. You need to be a little bit careful. The mere fact that you produce software doesn't make you a direct participant, but it's potentially possible, and certainly to the extent that a corporation is involved, and the corporate headquarters, et cetera, becomes a lawful military objective. It's much more important. We're a little bit careful about keeping the focus on public international law, not private international law, not international criminal law, and not intellectual property. We're focusing primarily on interstate relations, but it is certainly relevant, and the relevance comes below the threshold, where a company is taking hits and wants to hack back. That's the big question. And is there a monopoly on hacking back? Has the country violated the sovereignty? You know, companies don't violate the sovereignty of other states. States violate the sovereignty of other states. So what are the implications? So we'll be exploring that a lot. There's a lot of interest, by the way. I was talking to the general counsel of Microsoft about the project. He happens to be a former Air Force guy that I knew when he was in the Air Force. He's the National Security Council. And yeah, they're very interested in what we're doing, but it's not our audience. You know, I'm trying to write for legal advisors and so forth, so I don't think we're going to go into that in depth, because there's so much to do in the realm of countermeasures and the principle of necessity and violations of sovereignty and stuff. So the TILJ 3.0. By that point, you'll be very senior in government, and you can give us a grant through, of course, the Strauss Center at the University of Texas, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a good question. I just don't think we have the horsepower to really dig too deep into that issue, although it's fair. I will tell you, there's a new journal of
Law and
Cyber Warfare. Apparently, I think we're on the board or something. At any rate, the guy called me. He's some wealthy guy, and that's his focus. He wants to run events that bring together people like us who work on issues of public international law and government, and because his network is Microsoft, Intel, and so forth. So I think he's going to start an event in the fall, and that will be the first of a series to see whether or not we can add that in. I will tell you, like the event we had in Tallinn and the event we're going to run, guys don't know about it yet, we're going to run an event in Canberra at the Australian National University. That I nailed that down last week. Those events are kind of mining expeditions, we go out there and kind of say, is there something we do need to include in the manual? The first 30 pages of the manual is the result of exactly one of those meetings. We weren't going to discuss it, and then I told you I talked to Sir Daniel, and he said, Mike, blah, 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 and I went, oh, we better touch on that, so, maybe. Although, reality sucks. The reality is a certain amount of cash over a certain period, and it runs out, and we're racing towards the finish line right now, just dealing with state-on-state stuff.
So before, Sean, you pitch in, can I just add one more thing to what your question? You may have read over the last, I think it was last 2 weeks, Apple was just, they put out a new, I actually don't know what it was. It was a new version of their software. But it immediately had flaws. They're immediately found, and you probably saw the blogs went wild. Apple has been paid by NSA to build these flaws into their system so the NSA can hack that, right? And when Stuxnet used a Siemens, a flaw in some Siemens software, that was this, that's been the allegation as well, that maybe Siemens was in cahoots. So, maybe Google is in cahoots, right? Maybe they're on the NSA payroll. I don't know, but it would be a very interesting. It is a very interesting thing that people talk about. And it would be very interesting.
We're being recorded.
And I don't think Google has done anything wrong. I just put Google Fiber in my house, and I totally love Google. Sean.
Well, the center that sponsored the first manual and is sponsoring the second convenes what I think is maybe the best cyber law, policy, and tech conference every year in June there in Tallinn. They call it SciCon, and this year's SciCon I think is active defense measures, and I imagine that the participation of non-state actors in using active cyber defense measures is a big question, and as Mike said, we're big fans of mining those kinds of conferences for good stuff.
All right, we only have a couple of minutes left, so if there are any short questions.
The questions haven't been too long, it's the answers that have been too long, I think.
I was just curious on how a cyber attack occurs. The government, they hire some hackers and, send malware across and, the sea. So I don't have any expertise in that, and I was just wondering. Thank you.
I don't have a cell phone. I told you guys earlier. It beats me.
It's really dangerous to ask a lawyer a technical question. The first time we went to do this manual, or one of the first meetings we had with the manual, we actually had the techies come in and demonstrate a hack for us. And of course, it went completely over my head. I mean, I was watching this happen, and it was very cool, and suddenly he was doing this other thing to the computer. But one of the most interesting things that comes from that is hard for us to deal with, again, as a matter of law, is that generally the same kind of program or the same kind of process gives you access in order to gather data, as would also allow you to conduct nefarious activities. And so differentiating in cases, in some ways, between whether that thing, that hack, that attack, is a hack, is just gathering espionage, just they're looking, or if it's actually got a payload that then is delivered, or if it has a delayed payload that will be delivered upon command, or if it has a delayed payload that will be activated by the user, and so the implanter doesn't have any role. I mean, all these things make defining what that action actually is. I mean, it just adds a level of complexity to that that is interesting for us to do, and for which we have to rely on the science of it to really come to the right answer.
There are lots of ways to conduct cyber attacks, and they all have kind of different legal implications. So one of the things which I find, again, of the group, I'm the least cyber capable, knowledgeable, but one of the things I'm fascinated with is the notion of botnets. Mm-hmm. So like I go out and I take control of a whole bunch of other computers, and then I use those computers, I'm in control of those computers. I use those computers to basically flood a site that I'm targeting. So it's very interesting as a matter of law, because I may have computers in 29 different countries that are part of my botnet, and I'm attacking into another country. And you remember I was talking about where is the law going with regard to transit countries, with regard to the origins of an attack. Does a country have the responsibility not only to take measures to stop attacks that are originating, in other words, the guy that controls the bot, but also the countries where one of the zombie computers is located. Fascinating stuff. So it sort of depends on what sort of attack you're conducting. Is it a distributed denial of service? Is it malware? Is it a worm or a Trojan horse? I mean, there are all sorts of different things. And basically what happens is the way we do it in the group is we talk law. So we've just come back from a meeting in Tallinn where it was my turn. I delivered some product, and then these guys tried to show how smart they were by telling me how stupid I was. So we put it up there, but then the cyber guy is sitting there and he's going, okay, in law, here's a cool example of that. Here's a cool example. And then we go, whoa. That example changes our legal analysis. Let's use that example and pursue that. So, it's sort of a synergistic relationship, but the answer is there's no easy answer. There are lots of ways to conduct attacks, from walking in and putting bad stuff in a computer with a memory stick like Stuxnet, but then it gets out of control because some other guy has a memory stick and he takes stuff home to work on, then it goes into the net. Or you can transmit it in a wireless format. You can overload systems, all sorts of things.
So I'm going to take a minute over, but one other interesting thing that goes back to the non-state actors. You can go on the internet and buy all kinds of tools. You can rent a botnet. Some of these botnets are over 100,000 zombied computers. You can rent these for a fairly small sum. I once did an estimate where I could shut down BYU for less than $1,000. It's available out there, and don't tell BYU.
Shut down BYU by bringing a Coke and putting it in the middle of campus.
Or a cup of coffee. That's right. A cup of coffee. Who's gosh? But so one of the interesting things about this, as well as we talk about, in law, one of the key factors by which we have constrained the use of force is through weapons control treaties. But all weapons control treaties are between states, right? And so you have no, unless you get the weapons control, the state who signed up the weapons control treaty, controlling all the non-state actors within its territory, there is no constraints in terms of weapons control on non-state actors. And so it comes back to that great question you asked about non-state actors. It's just another level of complexity that's hard.
One of the Tallinn sessions that interested me most was when we devoted a little time exclusively to the tech guys. So they walked us through a few things. And I had always relied on analogy to help me understand cyber attack. Okay, this is like there being a gate guard at a post, and he's a sentry, and we fool him. We look like a civilian, we get past him, and then we do our damage. But what a lot of the technologists' explanations did for me was to disprove my analogies, that in fact, very often you're not walking past a sentry, there's nobody there. In fact, and the gate's not even closed. You're just walking right through these open ports. If you hear about a zero-day defect or some of the flaws that are put out there in software, you begin to get a more complete picture of how these things are delivered. It's the delivery systems that interest me the most and seem to have some pretty significant legal implications to them as well.
I know we're out of time, but who cares? There's a really, really interesting legal issue. I just, as I mentioned in the presentation, I just came back from a conference on autonomous weapon systems at Chatham House. Autonomous weapon system is a weapon system where you don't have, it's called man out of the loop. In other words, there's not someone in the loop, there's not someone controlling the weapon, there's not someone on the loop. In other words, there's not someone monitoring the system that engages, but it's a weapon system that you put it into a particular battle space and say, find these sorts of targets, da-da-da-da. So, like, everyone's really excited about this. There's this campaign that Jody's running called Stop Killer Robots. We're all writing on it. And we just had a conference at the War College on it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But a very interesting thing, and we haven't thought about, is what about an autonomous cyber weapon system? Because you see, there's a difference. If I have this thing, this weapon system, okay, and I'm going to make it autonomous, so I program it, I have to program it to go look for things. So I say to the weapon system, go out and destroy anything that's 5 inches tall, made of plastic, has either a fluid or is empty and has something red on it, okay? That autonomous weapons system will go out and it will go, whoa, look at that. That meets my criteria. I've been programmed to destroy that. I destroy that, okay? Now, the very interesting thing in cyberspace is if you can certainly also program malware to go out and look for a particular vulnerability. So I want to go after the BYU. We wanted to shut down BYU. I programmed the malware to go into the BYU system and do something. So I tell I identify a vulnerability, I exploit the vulnerability, so it's just like this, okay? But the other thing you can do with malware, and I called back to the Cyber Center to talk to some of the techies, is I can tell malware to go look for vulnerabilities. And I'm not telling it to go look for things that I program. Look for these characteristics. What I say is go out there and search and try to find Professor Watt's open gate. I don't know what the gate looks like. I don't know if it's big gate, a wide gate. I don't know. I don't know anything about the gate. But go try to find a gate, which raises all sorts of fascinating legal questions like distinction. You know, distinction requires you to distinguish between military objectives and civilian objects. Well, if you're just looking for open gates, how do you tell the autonomous malware not to go into the open gate into the military objective, or rather the civilian objective? So, you know, I think we're going to see, I just found this fascinating. It's unresponsive to any question that's been asked. But we have this big debate over autonomous weapon systems, and I think the big debate should be over autonomous cyber weapon systems, because when I look at autonomous weapon systems, I don't see a lot of problems. I've written a couple of articles on it. You can read them. I don't see too many problems. But when I start thinking about autonomous cyber weapon systems, they're so fundamentally, qualitatively different that I see lots and lots of IHL problems. So an interesting thing to publish in the Texas International Law Journal. Anyways.
I'm going to hold you to it. Okay, well, that wraps us up for today. We'll begin again tomorrow morning with breakfast out in the atrium at 8:30, and then panels start at 9. So, hope to see you then. And thank you.